to the May 8th edition of Fire on the Fives. This is Larry Van Bussum from the National Weather Service in Boise, Idaho. Fire on the Fives is a National Weather Service webinar that puts on information on wildland fire science and wildland environment science and policy and procedures and best practices. So we're going to kick off today's webinar. Just some logistical things to begin with. Please ensure that you mute your phone or use the audio pin provided. If you use the audio pin, then if you want to ask questions during the webinar, you will be able to. If you do not put in the pin, you will not be able to get unmuted. So again, if you've gotten a audio pin, please enter that now. This talk will be recorded and posted to the NWS Fire Weather YouTube at the URL below, or you can just do a search on YouTube for Fire on the Fives or NWS IMET, that's National Weather Service IMET. Another logistical thing for today's talk is that I believe this is going to be 2 hours and is going to be broken up into a couple of 45-minute segments. So what we'll do is we'll do a talk and then we will take a break and then come back in. It'll be a short break, but we will do so. Again, I remind everybody to use the mute on your phone and not the hold, or we'll get your hold music or the National Weather Service forecast for your area. With that, I would like to introduce for the May 8th, 2017 edition of Fire on the Fives, Scott Russell from the U.S. Forest Service South Carolina Coordination Center. Scott will be talking about critical incident stress management, or CISM, how to recognize and deal with stress during and after incidents. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Scott and Mike Proud.
Thanks, Larry. This is Mike Proud from the Columbia, South Carolina NWS office. We're grateful to have Scott here today to give this presentation, a little background of where this is coming from an NWS perspective. IMETs have always been out in the field performing the mission. I was fortunate enough and unlucky enough to have been up at the Gatlinburg, Tennessee fire. Saw a lot of death, a lot of injuries, a lot of destruction with that fire, and then was fortunate enough to have Scott make a presentation at our annual AOP meeting. I've also got other mechanisms in place. I've got a great MIC that's got a background dealing with stress management. I've also got a wife that's got 20+ years as a critical care nurse. So I had some people to fall back on, but after seeing Scott's presentation, my question became, what about the others in our agency? And as we kind of progress into more DSS support, what is everybody going to see? How are we going to feel? And to get some knowledge in the field of incident stress management as we move forward. Scott did graciously agree after our presentation at our annual AOP meeting to provide this. We tried to get it last month. Unfortunately, the Southeast had a big severe weather outbreak and we had to postpone it. So we're going to get this in today. So on that note, I will introduce Scott Russell from the U.S. Forest Service in Columbia and Critical Incident Stress Management.
Greetings, everybody, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Let me start off with a little bit of an apology. I woke up this morning with an allergy issue, so my voice is not quite what I was hoping it was going to be. As we get ready for today's presentation, I do like to do my presentations a little interactive, and that's going to be difficult with everybody remoting in. But I'm going to ask every group to have a pen and a piece of paper, something each individual can write on.
Okay, sorry everybody. Apparently Mike did not put in the audio pin, so I can't unmute him until he does so. I am sending his pin now. Please stand by. Okay, sorry about that. Just as you were saying that you like to be interactive is when I muted you by accident. Thank you.
All right, not a problem. Again, want to be a little interactive with you folks over the next couple hours. So everybody needs to have a pen and a piece of paper, something to write with, and a separate piece of paper. There will be a couple exercises we'll use that pen and paper with. The presentation is scheduled to go approximately an hour and 40 minutes, but we will break that up. We'll take a break midway through it. We will engage questions, whatever is the best method of receiving those questions. I'll be happy to answer questions as they come along. So let's start out with a little bit about who I am and why I was asked to do this presentation. My name is Scott Russell. I'm the Assistant Dispatch Center Manager with the U.S. Forest Service here in Columbia, South Carolina. I have 30 years of critical incident stress management training and experience, starting with my time in the U.S. military back in 1985. I served as an Army military policeman, which meant as a 19-year-old kid, I was given a badge, a gun, and a commission to go out and enforce state and federal laws. There's not a whole lot of 19-year-olds running around the country that are responding to fatality automobile accidents, homicides, and suicides. So being in the military as a military police officer, I was exposed to a fair amount of trauma as a 19-year-old with my military career. When I left the military in 1988, I started a quest to understand a little more about trauma and its impact on people. I wound up going to the University of South Florida, where I completed a master's degree in theology and became an ordained minister and chaplain. From there, it was a 2-year stint with the National Disaster Medical Services, where I served as a chaplain responding to federally declared disasters around the country. Most notable during that time frame was the Pentagon on 9/11, where the Georgia 3 disaster medical team, including myself, deployed to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. In June of 2002, I got bit by the wildland fire bug, and for those of you who have experienced wildland fire, you understand that can be quite addictive. Consequently, I walked away from the chaplaincy, and I became a line digger on a hand crew out west. Over the next several years, I wound up working my way up the chain of command in wildland fire, but eventually found my position in dispatch after being injured on a fire. Consequently, I made the switch from being an operations firefighter to a dispatcher, and that's led me to where I'm at right now. Throughout the course of my wildland fire career, however, I kept up with my critical incident stress management training, including being a peer supporter in 2010, and then getting the National Certification in Critical Incident Stress Management in 2016. So that's a little bit about my background and my firsthand experience in CISM, specifically as it relates to disasters and wildland fire. With that as context, I want to move on to the next part of our presentation, which is simply what is stress. There's a book definition of stress, which is the physical, cognitive, emotional, relational, and spiritual response to reality not meeting our desires or beliefs. Basically, it's how we respond to what we perceive to happen and what really happens. Now, as most of us know, what we anticipate happening in the world doesn't always work out the way we want it to. Quite frequently, it's better than we anticipated, and occasionally it's worse than we anticipated. In both cases, this creates stress within us. I want to be clear here that even positive events can cause stress. For example, we work hard to get a job promotion, but with that job promotion comes the stress and the responsibilities of new leadership or new position. So as we move through life, we find that frequently what we desire to happen, what we anticipate happen, doesn't line up exactly with what happens. For the meteorologist, how many times does our forecast exactly ring true with what we want to happen? Sometimes it does, but more often than not, we're off a little bit in one direction or the other with our numbers. Consequently, this is a cause of stress. Moving on to stress, I want to point out that we all have stress, but not all stress is bad. Finally, each of us has created tools for dealing with our stress. Because we were exposed to stress at a very early age, we inherently developed tools for dealing with stress. As a 3-year-old, when I didn't get what I wanted, my stress reaction was typically a temper tantrum. Now, as an adult, hopefully it's a different stress reaction than temper tantrum, but I have developed a different way for coping with my stress. Everybody has our ways of coping with stress. However, how we handle stress, how we manage stress can change on a day-to-day basis. This is known as our resistance to stress. Everyone's ability to handle stress is different on a daily basis, and everyone's amount or level of stress is different on a day-to-day basis. This actually gets to the crux of the problem in my mind and what started me on this quest as a military policeman. How can me and my patrol partner in the same vehicle respond to the same incident, both have the same exposure to the incident, and my patrol partner says, yeah, that was pretty bad, let's go to the next call, and I'm ready to call it quits and end my shift at that time. How does two people having the same exact exposure or experience wind up with completely different responses to the incident? What I like to call that is one person calls it a bad day, but tomorrow's going to be better. And the next person says, it was a bad day and I don't want to come back tomorrow. When a critical incident happens, early critical incident stress intervention, or CISM, is proven to reduce the long-term and traumatic effects of stress on us. So as you can see on the presentation there, it talks about two different reactions to the same exact situation. Two of you can have the same exact exposure, but because our daily stress level is different and our coping, our personal ability to handle stress fluctuates day by day, we can have completely different reactions to that stress. The overall concept of critical incident stress management is helping us to expand our capacity to handle the stress that occurs not only on a day-to-day basis, but that critical incident that gets thrown on top of our day-to-day stress that will cause some people to have a radically different reaction than other people will have. And we'll go into what those reactions can be and when to know that, you know, this is just another tough day, or perhaps we're having a real issue that needs to be worked on. So on our next slide, we're going to start out talking about different categories of stress. I mentioned earlier that there's good stress, also known as eustress. This stress will motivate, encourage, and improve our performance. Let me give you a couple of examples of good stress. Getting a job promotion is good stress. Getting married is good stress. I was fortunate enough to get married to my longtime fiance last December. I was on the beach just south of Charleston, South Carolina over New Year's, getting married on the beach itself. It's a wonderful experience to get married, as many of us know. However, I can assure you, coming up upon the day that we were getting married on the beach, I was extremely stressed about many factors, not the least of which is, what's the weather going to be like today? What's the wind going to be like today? Am I going to remember my vows? All these factors had me checking the weather every 15 minutes on my phone and reading through my vows right up until the time of the actual wedding ceremony. These are just a couple of examples of good stress and how they motivate and encourage us. A couple of other examples of good stress would be having a child or perhaps buying a house. So I've listed a couple of examples of what I consider to be good stress. What I'd like everybody to do is take about 60 to 90 seconds right now and talk amongst yourselves in your small work groups. Can you come up with other examples of what constitutes good stress? Go ahead and take a minute to discuss this. Good stress.
Having a party.
All right, I hope you guys are taking a couple minutes to talk about some good stresses in life. Here in the Columbia Weather Service office, we talked about planning and going on vacation. We talked about rites of passages such as birthdays and celebrations like that. We also talked about the holidays. So those are just a couple of additional examples that we came up with of good stress. These are positive things in our life, but they are definitely adding stress to our day-to-day lives. I want to move on from good stress or eustress and move into distress, which is the next topic. Distress is an intense stress that starts to exceed our coping mechanism and then causes intrusive or uncontrollable responses. Now, before you get caught up with the idea of intrusive and uncontrollable responses, let me give you a couple of examples of intrusive and uncontrollable responses to show you how mild these can be. Not sleeping well tonight. A minor case of insomnia is an intrusive and uncontrollable response. You're trying to sleep, but you're thinking about the work or something else that's gone on in your day or that may be coming up, good or bad, that's causing you to lose a little sleep at night. That's an idea of an intrusive, uncontrollable response. Another one would be if you go home at the end of your work shift and your spouse or partner is trying to explain to you about their day, but instead of listening to them, your mind is caught up on your day at work or the next day of work that you're planning, something that has caused you stress throughout the course of your day, and you're not being present with your spouse or your significant other. They have to call your attention back to the fact that you're off shift, you're at home now, your focus should be on them. Those are examples of the intrusive and uncontrollable responses. These do not have to be major or severe. They just interfere or interrupt with what you should be doing to be living in the present moment, whether it's simply sleeping at 2 o'clock in the morning instead of worrying about the project at work, or paying attention to your significant other instead of thinking about something that happened at the office today. So these could be very minor. That said, in distress, they start working their way towards being a little bit more major. For example, your significant other starts getting upset with you because for the third or fourth time today, while they've tried to talk to you, you were focusing on the job instead of being at home. These are examples of distress. One night, not a good night's sleep, little insomnia is not a major distress. If you're going on day 4 or 5, where no matter when or how you try and sleep, you keep waking up or can't get to sleep because you're worried about a situation, that's an example of distress. So I've listed a few examples of distress, but there's a whole list of examples of distress. I'd like you guys to take a minute and talk about some examples of when you think you are in distress or what distress would be. I do want to share with you, there's some handouts that were sent out earlier. They have a comprehensive list of different signs and symptoms of distress, and we're going to go over that handout, not verbatim, but to give you a more comprehensive picture of some of the signs and symptoms of distress. But in the meantime, I'd like you guys in your small groups to come up with a couple of ideas or a couple of symptoms when you know that perhaps this has gone from eustress to distress, where you're starting to have a little bit of a distraction from or an impingement upon your normal operations. So let's go ahead and take a minute or two, talk in your groups, and come up with some concepts of distress or examples of distress. And we'll come back to you in just a minute. Hey guys, I know we took more than just a couple of minutes there, but we had some great conversations about types of distress. Automobile accidents were one that was mentioned. Another one, former military folks and having to be in combat or the threat of being in combat could certainly cause some distress, some intrusive, uncontrolled response. A post-combat situation would be another one, maybe having some physical reactions, little shakes or something like that from a traumatic thing. It was interesting that automobile accidents were brought up because the number one cause of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a clinically diagnosed condition, is automobile accidents in the civilian world. So an automobile accident is more likely to result in PTSD than any other thing that a civilian will encounter. So we all drive, most of us pretty much every day, and yet then that can cause post-traumatic stress disorder. So just sharing what we discussed here in the Columbia office. I hope that some of you have had some great discussions in your office as well. Again, I do want to emphasize we're going to go over different categories or different types of stress reactions that are common and typical post-traumatic incident. And there is a handout that covers them all in depth, and we will at least mention that. You should have received that electronically. If not, I can assure you that Mike Crowd will make sure that you do get a copy of it later on. So, all right, let me move on from good stress to distress to the third category that we need to address, which is impairment. Impairment is very bad stress. It is defined as the intense stress that impairs one or more areas of an individual's life, prohibiting them from fully functioning. Examples of impairment would be so caught up in a previous situation that it is deeply and seriously impacting your personal life, or deeply and seriously impacting your work performance. If you have an automobile accident and nobody's injured, that's a form of distress. On the other hand, it may be a situation where you suddenly start driving 2 or 3 miles out of your way to avoid the intersection where you had that automobile accident. That's potentially a sign of impairment, especially if it affects things like your ability to get to work on time or another major area of your life. Now, if you do that over a couple of days, is that impairment? No, that's a typical stress response, an aversion to the situation. I don't want to get back into that situation. However, if 3 months down the road you're still refusing to drive a vehicle at all, that would be a symbol of perhaps impairment. So identifying eustress or good stress, distress or bad stress, and then moving into a level of impairment. So these are just the 3 levels, if you will, or types of impact that stress can have. This is where we're moving from simply struggling with our day-to-day operations to literally drowning in one area of our lives. Now, I want to be real clear here that you can be fully functioning in 1 or 2 areas of your life and still suffer a major impairment in a 3rd area of your life. For example, everything can be fine at work and you perform your duties at work totally fine, but if the stress of the job is causing you to shut down at home to such an extent that you're needing to seek counseling or perhaps even looking at ending a relationship, that would be a level of impairment. Flip side is everything can be perfectly fine at home, and yet the work-related stress can have you walking in one day and telling the boss, thank you, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, but I've just quit, and walking out the door. These are examples of impairment, something that radically changes an area of your life. It doesn't have to be multiple areas of your life, but certainly is an area of your life. I'm going to go ahead and put us back on mute because I want each group to talk about what does impairment look like to you. So we'll take another couple of minutes here. We've talked about good stress. We've talked about distress. What does impairment look like in your life? Take a couple of minutes and we'll get back to you. All right, we're back with you guys. We talked about things like anger management, a radical change or excess use of drugs or alcohol, long-term sleep deprivation, or simply being so afraid that you're going to miss something that you become hyper-vigilant in a situation. That could be everything from monitoring the weather radar to missing the radio call in the dispatch center or the fire department. So when you become so hyper-vigilant that it starts to affect other avenues of your life, clearly a sign of impairment at that point. So that's when you've gone from struggling to the drowning example. So we've talked about stress as levels of impact, good stress, bad stress, and impairment. We're going to look at another way that we identify or address stress, and that's by the cause of the stress or the causality of the stress. So moving on to our next slide, we're going to talk about cumulative stress. This is the stress that happens in everybody's life on a regular basis, but we may or may not spend a lot of time focusing on it simply because stress having occurred to us from a very early age, we've developed coping mechanisms for dealing with stress. So these are the ongoing or minor stressors that we have in our lives, sometimes known as the background stress. This is one that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, and yet then this is the foundation of stress in our lives. When we talk about something stressing us out or overwhelming our stress or leading to distress or possibly impairment, this is what's happening on top of our background or our cumulative stress. It's individually manageable, but when combined can cause distress. Now, I'll give a few examples of this. A flat tire may be a minor argument at home or at work. Shift changes would be another perfect example. That first day or two that you move from days to mids, not just quite within 100%. There's a change in your sleep pattern, maybe a change in your eating pattern that affects this. This is an idea of cumulative stress. It's part of the job, it's part of the operations. It's not anything big or traumatic. However, each of us will define our cumulative stress differently. I was chatting with one of my law enforcement friends recently, and he said that the other day, to blow off stress, he took his lights and sirens and turned them on and went over 100 miles an hour driving his patrol car. To him, that was a stress reliever. For me personally, driving my car past 70 miles an hour is a form of stress in my life, not a stress reliever. So for each of us, our background stress, our cumulative stress is going to be different. Not every one of us has a flat tire on the way to work or has an argument with our significant other. But chances are somebody had that experience sometime this week in their lives, and that's going to add to their background stress. If left unmanaged over the course of long term, then we build up this stress level to a point that it becomes distress or it exceeds our capability to manage or cope with it. Sometimes known as the straw that broke the camel's back. In and of itself, not a significant event, but combined with every other minor stressor in our lives, it overwhelms our ability to manage, and then it becomes a distress or an impairment. So what might be a minor distress to me may become an impairment to somebody else simply because their level of background stress that they've got in their lives. The background stress can be added on top of an acute or a critical incident stress. So each one of us has a different level of background stress that we're going on, and on top of that, we're going to pile an acute stress or a specific situation stressor into our lives. Depending upon our level of background stress, that may or may not overwhelm our coping mechanisms. So everybody's got this cumulative or background stress. We don't work in a vacuum. We don't live in a vacuum. All of us are experiencing this stress, this cumulative stress, in our lives on a day-to-day basis. However, for the most part, we've come up with our tools, our coping mechanisms for handling this type of stress. What happens, however, is on top of that, something will occur. This is where we get into acute stress. It's a specific incident that causes us distress. We've already talked about what distress is. This is a specific incident that breaks that camel's back, that causes us to be overwhelmed. Maybe we're only overwhelmed on a short-term basis, in which case we're in distress, and it takes us a little bit of time to get our equilibrium back and to pull that back into a managed stress. However, in an acute stress situation, it doesn't have to overwhelm our typical coping mechanisms. It adds to it. It takes us right to the edge. Maybe we need to disengage for a couple of minutes. We need to take a 5-minute breather. We need to add a coping mechanism. But this tends to be a very short-term additional coping mechanism to get this from an acute situation incorporated into our cumulative stress and managed. This is not a situation that will typically lead us to an impairment. What typically leads us to an impairment will be the next one that we talk about. But let's talk about this stress, this acute stress. The examples I give: an automobile accident, perhaps an intense argument. A job loss would be a pretty serious form of that. Maybe it's a reprimand at work or something like that. Not quite to the extreme where your life gets impaired, but nonetheless a fairly stressful situation. And it's a specific event. It's not just the background stress, the typical day-to-day stress. So this is examples of the acute stress that can occur in your life. The third type of stress I'm going to talk about is the critical incident stress. There's a very specific definition to critical incident stress. I want to acknowledge the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. They're the world's leader in training people on critical incident stress management. In the United States Forest Service, as well as the Department of Interior, this is the official and only approved training program for critical incident stress management. I want to emphasize that there are other programs out there. There are other programs out there that focus more on traumatic response to injury, traumatic response to incidents. There's a traumatic incident reduction program out there. Those are different programs, but for the purposes of the Department of Interior as well as the Department of Agriculture, we do defer to the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, and it is their definitions, their terminology, and their tools that I will be presenting to you today. You can find them on the internet if you'd like to take a look for them, and I do have some reference material for that organization and their training later on. But a critical incident stress is specifically a heightened cognitive, physical, emotional, spiritual, behavioral arousal or agitation, if you would prefer, that accompanies a crisis. So it's going to affect you either physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or in your relationships. And this accompanies a crisis. In order to understand this, we need to understand that a crisis is a cognitive, physical, emotional, spiritual, or behavioral reaction to an atypical event that is usually referred to as an awful, powerful event or a terrible stimulus. Let me go back to what a crisis is, because a crisis is not the automobile accident itself. The crisis is not the fatality itself. The crisis is an individual's reaction to such an event. If you are a coroner, dealing with a dead body is another day at the office. For me personally, dealing with a fatality situation, that is going to cause a reaction in me that could very easily be classified as a crisis. So it's not the event, it is the individual or individual's reaction to an event that constitutes a crisis or not. Because again, we all have a different background and a different definition of what creates cumulative stress in our lives. So when we start talking about critical incident stress, we are talking about the individual's reaction to the incident itself that is a crisis, not the incident itself. Recently, I had the opportunity to sit with a group of law enforcement officers as they were sharing their individual incidents that led them into crisis. And I personally started to feel a little overwhelmed after the fifth or sixth one. Fortunately, a good friend of mine, a mental health professional sitting next to me, realized my reaction and realized I was going into a state of crisis. And he casually leaned over and said, focus on the people, not their incidents. And by bringing that back to me that we were dealing with people's reactions and not the terrible incidents that they were relating to us, I was able to move from a point of agitation, borderline crisis, back into my role as a peer facilitator of the situation. So again, the crisis is the individual's reaction to an event. It is not the event itself. So that is what critical incident stress and critical incident stress management is about. We're not there responding to an incident. We are there to respond to people's reactions and how they are coping or managing with a specific incident. So when we talk about critical incident stress management, we're not talking about dealing with the incident. We're talking about dealing with the people who were affected by an incident, and it's how those people are affected that determines what level of critical incident stress management intervention will take place. That's one of the key points I want to get across in this presentation, is that it's about the people's reaction to an incident, not the incident itself that we're dealing with. So I mentioned before, talking a little bit about stress and what causes us stress. I've asked for some examples of what causes us stress, and basically almost anything can cause us stress. But as we think about it, what causes us stress, there's a couple of things that we want to go over. Pretty much any time that something happens that is not what we expected, anticipated, or planned to occur. Doesn't have to be bad, doesn't have to be good. It could be simply the process of us anticipating something going to happen that causes us stress. But there's a lot of factors that will contribute to stress in our life, and whether something is a background stress, a positive stress, a eustress, or whether it becomes a negative stress. Let me give you some examples of factors that contribute to our stress. There's some environmental factors. How much sleep did we get? How much exercise did we get? Are we eating healthy? These factors all contribute to how we handle our stress. Some of these factors we can control, and some of these factors we cannot control. For example, some of the factors that we can try and control are such things as what's our working environment? Is it too loud? Is it not loud enough? Is it too warm? Is it too cold in here? Most of us have the ability to adjust the temperature in a building. If you're on a fire line someplace, backing out of the flames a little bit. Maybe it's getting a little too hot for you there. Most of us are given the opportunity to get 8 hours of rest a night. Now, they may not happen exactly when we'd like them to occur, but we can prioritize those things. We can prioritize our choice of eating. So these are all things that we can do that can affect our stress level that we can control. However, there are certainly some factors we cannot control. We cannot control the weather. All we can do is identify what's happening in our environment in that category. One of the things that's critical, one of the things that is taught in the chaplaincy is identify those things that you can control and let go of those things you cannot control. So we're getting ready to take a 10-minute break here. And as we do this, I do want you guys to start thinking about this. What is it that we can control in our lives that affect our stress? And what are those things that are beyond our ability to control? And what do we do about them? So at this point in time, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and we'll rejoin with y'all shortly.